Guys, welcome to your last class in Topic 1, Foundations of Environmental Systems and Societies, where we are going to start to talk about humans and pollution. Humans and their ability to pollute environmental systems is sort of a running theme in this course, so this sets the groundwork for a conversation that is definitely going to continue in the rest of the units and chapters that we cover. The first thing that we need to do is be able to define pollution. So when we talk about pollution, we are talking about the addition of a substance to the environment by human activity at a rate greater than that at which it can be rendered harmless by the environment. And that part's important. And which has an appreciable effect on the environment. So anything can be a pollutant as long as we are adding it to an environment faster than it can be naturally taken away, and it is having some kind of an effect on the environment. Here you see two examples. This is a great example of eutrophication happening in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the Mississippi River draining out into the Gulf, and all of this green here is the beginning of overproduction of algae, of algal bloom environments. And that's because phosphorus and nitrates are being added into this water faster than they can be taken away. And the other example that you can see here is this is a bird that's been dissected after it's dead, and its stomach is all full of plastic. And so that's another example of a substance that is being added to the environment at a rate greater than the rate at which it can be taken away. Because as we all know, we can make plastics relatively fast, but it takes a really, really long time for them to break down naturally in the environment. So when we talk about pollution, pollutants, there are different substances that we can say that do this, and they fall into a few categories. You can talk about organic or inorganic matter, so that's just substances that contain carbon and substances that don't. You can also talk about energy pollution, which is getting to be a bigger and bigger problem in the world, and that's heat and light pollution, and you can see an example of that in this picture right here. There's all of these lights. The city at night, any city that you're in that's creating appreciable light in the darkness, that's adding light to that environment at a rate faster than it can be neutralized by a natural night environment. And some of the problems that can lead to are trouble in animal migration paths and confusion in plant cycles. So that's significant, the problem of heat and light pollution. You can also talk about a living organism as a pollutant. And what we see this as the best example is in commercial agriculture systems. We're creating these systems that are so full of living organisms that they're producing waste at a rate that it could never be naturalized by the environment that they live in. And that's where you see like methane pollution coming out of feedlots as a really big problem. So those are the different substances that we call pollutants. We can also classify pollution and pollutants based on where they're coming from and how they're appearing. So we have primary and secondary pollutants. Primary just means a pollutant that is active on emission, like when carbon dioxide comes out of your car, that is active right away. Secondary means that it's formed by primary pollutants mixing together. The example of a secondary pollutant that we focus on most in this course is the secondary pollutant of smog, which is when a mix of different primary pollutants come together with heat and sunlight to form that sort of dirty gray air that you see around big cities a lot. And we talk about photochemical smog a lot more in topic 6. The other way that you can classify pollutants in terms of their source is whether they are point or non-point source pollutants. And this is relatively obvious. Point is from an obvious specific place. Non-point is when pollutants are mixed together and hard to differentiate. And that we talked about a little bit in the last section, the idea of sustainability and tragedy of the commons. Non-point source pollutants are a big problem in the tragedy of the commons because if you're polluting but you can't see the immediate effects of your specific pollution, you're much less likely to be motivated to do something to clean it up. So those are some of the different ways that we can classify pollutants. And when you have pollution classified in different categories, some are obviously more worrisome than others. The class of pollutants that is most concerning to a lot of scientists is a class of pollutants called persistent organic pollutants. Persistent organic pollutants are substances that have a high molecular weight. They're soluble in fats, but not in water. So that means they can be absorbed into your body, but can't be diminished in natural aquatic environments. And they persist in the environment for a long time because of this idea that they're soluble only in fat and not in water. They can't be broken down in natural environments very easily. So persistent organic pollutants are likely to both bioaccumulate and biomagnify. When we talk about bioaccumulation, that's just the idea that something is gathering in a living organism. So if you ingest something that has a persistent organic pollutant in it, it's likely that that will stay in your tissues. It will accumulate in your tissues for a long time. When we talk about biomagnification, that takes into account the idea that if there's a pollutant that's present in a low level, low on a food chain, as you move up the food chain, that pollutant is going to get more and more concentrated. So keep that in mind because we'll come back to that idea in a little while. So some examples of persistent organic pollutants are DDT, PCBs, and dioxins. DDT was a really common insecticide in the 1950s and 1960s. PCBs are used in coolants and electrical appliances. They used to sometimes be used in plastics. And dioxins we see most commonly now as a result of trash incineration. It's like a concentrated ash that has this halogenated chlorine molecule basis that's really hard to break down. So as environmentalists and as human beings, we are concerned about persistent organic pollutants because in the human body, we don't really know how they react. We know that they're likely to cause cancer and they can disrupt hormones. And it's hard to get these things out of our environment. So it's likely that we will be dealing with the impacts of persistent organic pollutants for a long time. Next, let's talk a little bit about this idea of tragedy of the commons as it relates to pollution. So if we read this scenario, it talks about something called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is something they talk a lot about in political science classes and a lot about in sociology. And it's always some variation on this idea up here. So when we talk about it in pollution, we can say that two companies are suspected of non-point source pollution, but there's not enough evidence to convict them unless they confess. They're separated and offered the same deal. If one admits that both are guilty, that one will go free and the other is sentenced to 10 years. If both stay silent, both go to prison for a year. If they both admit to whatever they did wrong, they both go to prison for 5 years. Neither knows what the other will do. What is the best scenario? And in the pollution edition of Prisoner's Dilemma, there's a secret third option, which is if both stay silent, the prescribed punishment is that both would go to prison for a year. But in reality, when a big company stays silent about its pollution, it can throw lawyers at the legal problems that pollution creates for years and really never have to face any significant consequences for what they're doing. So generally, in the pollution edition of Prisoner's Dilemma, no one says that they are responsible for any pollution and no one faces any consequences, which is why this quote is particularly important. Peter Wood said that every country wants global emission reductions, but would prefer that someone else take on the burden. So no one wants to see their own country having to be penalized for something that no one is willing to admit that they're doing, which is part of the reason why pollution, human-caused pollution, has become such a significant problem. When you do try to manage the problem of pollution, there are 3 tiers of activity that you can exist in. The first is trying to take account for the human activity producing the pollutant. So you're trying to change people's minds about whether or not they should be polluting through education and campaigns about awareness of what pollutants do. The second is trying to take into consideration the release of pollutants into the environment. And the way that you do that is you control the release through laws and technology. The third is that you try to deal with the impact the pollutant has on the system. And at this point, the damage has already been done, and you are just trying to clean up a damaged ecosystem. So if you had to rank these in order of effectiveness, dealing with the human activity producing the pollutant is always the most effective thing you can do, followed by dealing with its release, followed by dealing with its cleanup. And currently we live in a world where we are trying to deal with a lot of cleanup. And something that you're going to do for your homework actually has to do with trying to look at how people deal with cleaning up pollutants. So let's look at that right now. Your last homework assignment for Unit 1 of this course is, if you're following along in this great textbook, go ahead and read pages 48 to 53 in the Oxford Press Environmental Systems and Societies 2015 edition. And if you're not, you can go right to this writing assignment. I want you to do some independent research on DDT. Remember, DDT is a persistent organic pollutant that was used as a commercial insecticide for a long time. I want you to talk about the uses of DDT, the advantages of DDT, and the disadvantages of DDT. And the reason that I want you to do this is that a lot of times on Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams, you are asked to discuss and evaluate specific pollutants. Sometimes they give you a named pollutant, sometimes they don't. And it's a good idea to always have some information about DDT stored away in your mind, because it's one of those things that has a tendency to show up a lot on your IB exams. So this is research that you can do on your own on the internet. It's an interesting topic. Take 10 or 15 minutes to look over some information, fill out this table, and when you are ready, go to the review video and we will go over what some possible answers to this discuss and evaluate question would be. See you there.